In the vast, wind-bitten heart of Wisconsin, there once stood a farmhouse so ordinary it almost disappeared into the horizon. It sat on the outskirts of Plainfield, a small, stubborn farming town where people minded their own business, and the silence at night could stretch for miles. There, in 1906, Edward Theodore Gein was born. No one could have imagined that this quiet child, pale and watchful, would one day turn that farmhouse into something unspeakable, a place where nightmares took form, where the line between love and madness decayed just as surely as the bodies beneath the soil. His parents, George and Augusta Gein, were a study in contrasts. George was a carpenter and tanner whose hands were calloused, his spirit pickled in whiskey. He drifted from one failed job to another, haunted by disappointment. Augusta, his wife, was the opposite, fierce, devout, and convinced that the world was soaked in sin. She ruled her household not with affection, but with sermons, quoting scripture to keep her husband and sons trembling beneath her judgment. From the very start, Augusta made it clear that the world beyond their doors was rotten. Women, she said, were agents of corruption. Lust was a disease. The townsfolk were godless. She isolated her family, dragging them to a remote farm where her control could be absolute. The farmhouse became a fortress of faith, or rather, of fear. While other children laughed in the schoolyard, Ed spent his days under his mother's heavy gaze. He adored her, feared her, and absorbed her warnings as if they were holy writ. When she read aloud from her worn Bible, describing fire and punishment, Ed listened as if God himself were speaking through her. He was not a violent child. Teachers remembered him as polite, even gentle, but strange. He avoided other children, laughed nervously at odd times, and seemed more at ease in solitude than conversation. When he tried to make friends, Augusta scolded him, telling him that other people were evil and would drag him to damnation. So Ed retreated, into chores, into fantasy, into his mother's suffocating embrace. There were only 4 people in the Gein family: Augusta, George, Ed, and his older brother Henry. But even in that tiny circle, Augusta's influence dominated. George's drinking turned him cruel, and the boys grew up watching him stumble, rant, and occasionally lash out. Augusta used his failures as proof that all men who strayed from God were doomed. By the time Ed reached adolescence, the outside world had become foreign to him. He spent his days reading pulp magazines, anatomy books, and religious tracts. He learned to tan hides, a skill that, years later, would resurface in the most grotesque way imaginable. He dreamed of a life beyond the farm, yet he couldn't imagine leaving his mother. The 1920s brought change to Wisconsin, but not to the Gein household. While radios and automobiles filled other homes with excitement, the Geins' world stayed frozen in an earlier century. The farm struggled. George drank more heavily. Ed took odd jobs in town, repairing fences, mowing lawns, babysitting for neighbors. People found him trustworthy enough, if a little strange. He was shy but gentle, and children liked him. Behind that quiet exterior, though, something was forming, a dependency, a worship. Augusta's teachings had fused with his own yearning for affection. She was his only moral compass, his only source of comfort. When she praised him, he felt saved. When she scolded him, he felt damned. In 1940, George Gein died of heart failure brought on by alcoholism. Few in Plainfield attended the funeral. Augusta told her sons that their father's death was a mercy, that now the family could be pure. Ed accepted this without question. But Henry, the older brother, began to doubt. He started to talk back, quietly at first, then with growing defiance. He told friends in town that Ed's attachment to their mother was unnatural, that Augusta's sermons were poisoning their minds. He wanted to leave the farm, to start a life of his own. In May 1944, a brush fire broke out on the Gein property. The brothers went out to control it, but when the flames died down, only Ed returned. He told police he'd lost sight of Henry in the smoke. Hours later, Henry's body was found face down on the scorched earth, his head bruised but without burns. The coroner ruled the death accidental. Smoke inhalation, they said. No one looked too deeply. After all, this was Plainfield. People minded their own. From that day on, Ed lived alone with Augusta. Her health declined, Her sermons grew sharper, her world smaller. She depended on Ed for everything, and he lived for her approval. When she suffered a series of strokes, he nursed her day and night. But when she finally died in December 1945, something inside him broke. Ed would later describe it as losing his only friend. But it was more than grief, it was disorientation. Without Augusta, there was no right or wrong, no boundary between love and obsession. He sealed her bedroom off like a shrine. No one was allowed to enter. He covered her furniture with sheets, locked the door, and left it untouched for the rest of his life. The rest of the farmhouse began to decay. Newspapers stacked in corners. Rodents scurried across the floorboards. In the kitchen, unwashed dishes gathered dust. Only the rooms Augusta had sanctified remained clean. It was as if the rest of the house were dying, and only her ghost kept one part alive. Neighbors saw Ed less and less. When he did appear in town, he was quiet but polite, sometimes stopping by the hardware store or tavern. He did odd jobs, fixing machinery, helping with threshing. He talked to people, but rarely looked them in the eye. They said he laughed at strange moments, as if at jokes no one else could hear. Sometimes he spoke of his mother as if she were still alive. "She's at home," he'd say. "Can't stay long." The years stretched on like the winters of Plainfield, long, pale, and silent. The farmhouse stood like a tomb in the fields. Its windows reflected nothing but emptiness. Inside, Ed read books about anatomy and death. He collected medical magazines that showed the human body opened up, dissected. Somewhere in that quiet, fascination began to blur with desire. He would walk through the empty rooms and imagine his mother's voice echoing down the hall. He began to visit cemeteries, first by day, then by night. He said later that he went there to be near her, though her truly referred to Augusta or something deeper remains uncertain. The world outside moved on. World War II ended. Cars filled the highways. Television entered American homes. But at the edge of Plainfield, the Gein farm remained locked in an earlier age. The lights seldom glowed at night. The mail piled up. The house seemed abandoned, except that sometimes, just before dawn, a faint glow could be seen in an upstairs window. No one knew what it was doing inside. No one imagined the kind of thoughts taking root in that isolation. In that house, a man's devotion to his mother was fermenting into madness. And soon, the town that had forgotten about the quiet bachelor at the edge of the fields would learn what happens when a lifetime of loneliness, repression, and death finally collapses into one horrific obsession. Because in the stillness of the Wisconsin plains, under that wide, empty sky, the story of Ed Gein, the man who would one day be called the Butcher of Plainfield, was only just beginning. When investigators finally stepped onto Ed Gein's snow-covered property that night in November 1957, none of them could have imagined what lay beyond that sagging farmhouse door. The place was dark, except for a single flickering bulb above the kitchen sink. The house smelled, an acrid, almost oily stench, mixed with something far worse. It was a kind of smell that clung to your throat, heavy and sweet, impossible to ignore. As Sheriff Schley pushed open the door, the beam of his flashlight cut across the cluttered kitchen. Piles of newspapers towered toward the ceiling. Tin cans, broken radios, empty cereal boxes, and stacks of old mail lined every corner. But it was what hung in the center of the room that froze them in place. A human carcass, headless, strung up like a deer, split down the middle. The sheriff took a step back. He'd hunted all his life, but never had he seen anything like this. The corpse, later identified as hardware store owner Bernice Warden's, was stripped naked and hung upside down by ropes attached to the rafters. She'd been shot once with a .22 rifle. Her torso had been gutted clean, like an animal being prepared for butchering. The officers scattered to the house, some gagging, others whispering prayers. Every inch of the farmhouse was coated in grime. Dishes crusted with food were fossilized to the sink. Rodent droppings covered the floor. But the deeper they went, the more they realized this wasn't just filth. It was madness carefully arranged. In a corner sat a wastebasket made of human skin, a chair upholstered in the same, a box of preserved noses, a bowl made from a skull, faces, literal faces, peeled and dried, hanging from nails on the wall like grotesque trophies. The officers would later describe it as a museum of horrors. They found masks fashioned from human skin, hollow eyes staring back at them. The lips of some had been painted with lipstick, others stitched into frozen grins. On the bedposts, skulls had been mounted like ornaments, and in a brown paper bag near the stove, Mary Hogan's head, perfectly preserved, her features still recognizable from the missing posters that had once hung around town. Everywhere they turned, they found more pieces of the unimaginable, a belt made of nipples, a box of preserved organs, and the skulls of women turned into makeshift bowls. Investigators quickly realized that Gein had been grave robbing, stealing from local cemeteries, exhuming women who reminded him of his late mother, Augusta. When questioned later, Ed Gein claimed he visited the graves of recently deceased middle-aged women who resembled Augusta. He would dig them up during moonless nights, take parts of their bodies, and fashion them into objects or wear their skin as suits. He said it wasn't for pleasure or murder. It was for connection. He wanted to become his mother, to crawl back into her skin, to feel her presence again. His obsession with Augusta had begun long before the killings. She had raised him to believe that all women, except herself, were instruments of sin. To young Ed, her word was gospel. She isolated him from the world, forbidding him from forming friendships or speaking to women. When she died in 1945, his world shattered. He was left with no one, and in his loneliness, his grief twisted into something monstrous. The farmhouse became his sanctuary and his prison. The rooms Augusta had once occupied were locked, sealed off like a shrine. Dust lay thick on her bed, her clothes still hanging in the closet untouched. But beyond that closed door, the rest of the house rotted. He'd retreat into fantasy, reading pulp magazines about cannibals, Nazis, and headhunters. It was as if his mind began to rot along with the walls. When police searched his yard, they found more evidence buried in shallow pits: bones, fragments of skulls, and partial remains. The sheriff's men could barely process what they were seeing. It was as though the entire property was an altar built to madness and decay. The news spread across Wisconsin like wildfire. In the tiny town of Plainfield, neighbors locked their doors for the first time in decades. Farmers whispered that they'd always known something was off about Ed, how he'd giggled to himself at the grocery store or talked about visiting the cemetery late at night. But no one had imagined this. The quiet handyman they'd trusted to babysit their kids and patch their windows had turned out to be a monster living among them. Reporters flooded the town, cameras snapping photos of the farmhouse as law enforcement carried out bags of evidence. But behind the headlines, something deeper stirred, a cultural terror. Ed Gein's crimes weren't just shocking. They forced people to question what could lurk inside ordinary men. During his interrogation, Ed spoke with eerie calm. He admitted to killing Mary Hogan and Bernice Wardens, but denied any sexual motive. Instead, he said he wanted to make a woman's suit, a full body skin he could wear to transform himself into his mother. "I wanted to feel like her," he said softly, "to be her." Psychologists would later describe Gein as a man torn between worship and hatred of women. He longed for connection, yet his mother's teachings had made him see intimacy as evil. His crimes weren't just murders. They were a desperate attempt to reconcile that contradiction. By the time the investigation ended, authorities had cataloged dozens of macabre items. For noses, 9 masks of human skin, 10 heads, and organs stored in jars. Yet perhaps the most haunting discovery wasn't what they found, but how ordinary Gein seemed even in confession. He didn't rage or weep. He spoke as though describing a chore, casual, polite, emotionless. One officer would later say, "He talked about digging up graves like you, or I would talk about going to the store." As dawn broke over the frozen fields of Plainfield, the farmhouse stood silent, a monument to depravity. Reporters would soon call it the House of Horrors, and its story would ripple far beyond Wisconsin. Within a few years, it would inspire some of the most iconic horror characters in cinema history. But for the people of Plainfield, this was no story. It was real. Mothers began sleeping with lights on. Children refused to walk past the Gein property. And yet behind all the headlines and horror, a chilling truth lingered. Ed Gein had not seen himself as evil. To him, It had all made sense in some fractured way. He believed he was resurrecting his mother, piece by piece. And as investigators stood among the remains of his twisted devotion, one question echoed louder than any other. How many more secrets were buried beneath that frozen ground? Because Plainfield's soil still held stories no one wanted to dig up. In the days following Ed Gein's arrest, the farmhouse became a crime scene and a spectacle. Police cordoned off the property, but curious locals crept as close as they dared, whispering about what might still lie buried beneath the frost. Reporters arrived from Chicago, Minneapolis, and even New York, turning the quiet town of Plainfield into a carnival of disbelief. Inside, investigators cataloged what they could stomach. Outside, the townspeople tried to make sense of it all. How could a man who fixed their fences and shoveled their driveways have been capable of such horror? The answer, it seemed, began long before the killings, long before the grave robberies. Back with one woman, Ed Gein. Augusta was not a mother in the conventional sense. To Ed, she was a prophet, a saint, a tyrant, and a god. Born in 1878, she grew up in a strict Lutheran household, and as an adult, her beliefs hardened into fanaticism. She despised alcohol, sex, and women who tempted men into sin. She believed the world was corrupt, and only she and her sons, Henry and Edward, were righteous enough to survive it. Her husband, George, was a broken man, an alcoholic who drifted from job to job. Augusta loathed him but refused a divorce, fearing the church's judgment. So she turned her devotion inward, to her boys, especially Edward. When Ed was born in 1906, she claimed God had given her a pure child, one who would never fall victim to sin if raised correctly. She enforced strict isolation on the family's farm outside Plainfield, allowing little contact with the outside world. No friends, no visitors, no laughter. Each night, she read scripture aloud to her sons, focusing on verses about death, punishment, and female corruption. In her eyes, the world was a rotting orchard, and women were its worms. Young Ed absorbed every word. He was a quiet, awkward boy who did his chores diligently and obeyed without question. But when he tried to make friends at school, Augusta scolded him. When he laughed with a girl, she struck him across the face. "You'll catch disease," she'd hiss. "They're all filthy." Over time, Ed stopped trying. His world shrank to the borders of that lonely farm. His mother's approval became his only source of warmth. Even after his father's death in 1940 and his brother Henry's mysterious death 4 years later, a deathsome in town still whispered Ed might have caused, Augusta remained his compass. When she suffered a stroke in 1945, Ed devoted himself to caring for her. But when she finally died that December, something inside him collapsed. Neighbors remembered seeing him days later, sitting motionless on the front porch, staring into the frozen fields. He spoke to no one. He sealed off her bedroom, preserving it exactly as she left it, her Bible open, her rosary draped over the bedpost, her clothes folded neatly in the dresser. It was as if he couldn't accept that she was gone. In the years that followed, Ed's world blurred between the living and the dead. He spent his nights reading pulp magazines, true crime anatomy, and tales of headhunters and Nazi experiments. His isolation deepened and his fantasies grew darker. He began visiting the cemetery under cover of night. He claimed he'd fall into trances, waking up beside open graves, sometimes with no memory of digging. He said he'd talk to his mother during these visits, that she would call to him. Eventually, those midnight visits weren't enough. When the voices told him to bring her back, he obeyed. He began exhuming corpses of women who resembled Augusta, women with middle-aged faces, heavy frames, and familiar eyes. He brought them home, dissected them, preserved their skin, and crafted grotesque relics. To him, they were not corpses, they were vessels. Pieces of his mother he was piecing together again. When questioned, he said he never meant to harm anyone. But then came Mary Hogan. Mary was a tavern owner, loud, brash, and everything Augusta had despised. She vanished in 1954. When her bar was found splattered with blood, people joked that Ed, the shy bachelor, must have carried her off. He laughed along, replying, "She's not missing, she's at my place now." No one realized he meant it literally. 3 years later, Bernice Warden's disappeared on the morning of November 16th, 1957. Her hardware store was empty, and a trail of blood led out the back door. The last receipt she wrote was for antifreeze sold to Ed Gein. When police arrested him that evening at a grocery store, he seemed calm, even polite. He didn't resist. He spoke softly, like a man confessing a sin he had long expected to be found out for. That night, as deputies discovered Bernice's mutilated body hanging in his shed, Ed sat in custody and whispered to the sheriff, "She's in the shed, like a deer." He said it without fear, without regret, as though describing a household chore. Over the following days, as his confessions poured out, it became clear that Ed's mind had been divided for years. He described speaking to Augusta's voice, obeying her commands, feeling her presence guiding him as he worked. When she died, she hadn't left, at least not in his world. She'd simply changed forms. Doctors later diagnosed him with schizophrenia and necrophilic tendencies, describing his acts as both delusional and ritualistic. But in Plainfield, psychological terms couldn't explain the horror. People said it was evil, pure and simple, evil born not from desire, but from devotion gone rotten. The farmhouse was sealed off, evidence piled high, and the remains of countless unknown women were stored away as the world waited for his trial. But amid the chaos, Ed Gein's calm never broke. He'd smile at officers, make small talk about chores, and ask about the weather. It was as if he'd lived two lives. One as a quiet handyman everyone trusted, and another as a grave robber who slept beneath masks of human skin. In his fractured mind, Augusta's presence was still there, watching, judging, whispering. He once told psychiatrists, "When I wore her skin, I felt close to her again, like she wasn't really gone." For the townspeople, the nightmare was only beginning. But for Ed Gein, it was just the afterlife of his mother's will. The ghost of Augusta still ruling her son from beyond the grave. And as the farmhouse sat silent under Wisconsin snow, one truth began to spread. Ed Gein had not only murdered bodies, he had resurrected a belief that love, twisted by fear, can rot into something unspeakable. By the winter of 1957, the Gein farmhouse had become something else entirely. Not just a crime scene, but a mirror reflecting back America's buried fears. What investigators uncovered inside was not simply the work of a killer, but the architecture of a disturbed mind, preserved in dust and skin. There were no lights when Sheriff Art Schley and his men first entered. The single bulb in the kitchen flickered weakly, barely revealing what hung from the rafters. The air smelled of decay, sour, metallic, and thick with rot. Dust rose with every step, settling over the grotesque relics Ed had crafted in solitude. The first body they found was Bernice Warden's, hanging by her heels from the beams, decapitated and gutted like an animal. Her head, later discovered in a burlap sack, bore a single bullet wound just below the hairline. Her insides had been scooped out, her torso slit open in a crude mimicry of deer dressing. But that was only the beginning. As deputies moved deeper into the house, the beam of a flashlight caught something hanging on the wall. Not wallpaper, not cloth, but a mask. The skin was pale, stretched thin and brittle, with holes where eyes once were. And next to it, another face, and another. The inventory that followed would read like a catalog of nightmares. There were 9 human face masks, some tacked to the walls like hunting trophies. For noses, a pair of lips fashioned into a window shade pull, bowls made from skull caps, a belt woven entirely from human nipples, a chair upholstered with human skin. In a paper bag by the stove sat the heart of Bernice Warden's. Investigators filled notebooks, each item carefully listed, though no one could look for long without nausea. Every drawer, every trunk, every box held something else, fragments of what had once been people. And amid it all, one detail chilled them more than the rest. Everything was arranged neatly. The farmhouse wasn't chaos. It was order, a perverse order born of reverence. His tools were cleaned and lined up on the table. His collection was displayed with care. He hadn't seen these remains as trash. He'd seen them as sacred. It took days to search the entire house. Ed's bedroom was filthy, magazines, dust, and junk piled waist-high, but Augusta's room was spotless, preserved like a shrine. Her curtains remained drawn, her bed made, her Bible open on the nightstand of Proverbs 23. For the whore is a deep ditch, and the strange woman is a narrow pit. Investigators could feel it. Augusta's presence still lingered in those rooms. When questioned, Ed spoke freely. He didn't try to hide what he'd done. In fact, he seemed confused by the commotion. He explained how he would read obituaries, attend funerals, and then return at night to visit the newly buried women. He described how the cemetery soil was soft and easy to dig, how the moonlight made the tombstones glow faintly, and how he felt drawn, compelled, to the graves of women who looked like Mother. He said he never remembered the full nights, that sometimes he'd wake up at home, realizing he'd brought back a friend. Psychiatrists would later call these fugue states, moments when he drifted into delusion so deeply he ceased to distinguish dream from reality. To Ed, it wasn't murder or desecration. It was communion, and though he confessed to killing Bernice Wardens and Mary Hogan, he denied malice. He claimed he didn't want to hurt them. "I just wanted to see them," he told investigators. "See if they were like Mother." His words unsettled even seasoned officers. Sheriff Schley, a hardened man who'd seen suicides, accidents, and homicides, fainted during one interview. When he came to, he slammed Ed against the wall in fury, yelling, "You filthy beast!" But Ed just blinked, dazed, and murmured, "She told me to." She Augusta, always Augusta. The case hit the newspapers within hours. House of Horrors found in Plainfield. Butcher of Plainfield captured. Photographers climbed onto cars just to snap pictures of farmhouse. True crime writers, psychologists, and even Hollywood producers descended on Wisconsin. Within days, the Gein property became an American obsession. The farmhouse itself was sealed by authorities. Neighbors begged to have it torn down immediately, saying it was a curse upon the town. But for months it stood, a dark silhouette on the horizon, its windows black and empty, its barn door creaking in the wind. Locals swore they could see candlelight flickering in the upper window. Some said they heard Augusta's voice calling Ed's name across the fields. Others refused to go near it at all, convinced the land itself had turned unholy. Then, in March 1958, the Plainfield Town Board scheduled an auction for Ed's property. Reporters, collectors, and curiosity seekers planned to bid on his furniture and farm tools. But the night before the sale, flames tore through the farmhouse. By dawn, it was gone. Only the foundation remained. No one was ever charged with arson, though nearly everyone in Plainfield silently agreed it was for the best. The devil's house, one farmer said, shouldn't have walls. After the fire, Ed Gein's life moved indoors, into the walls of state hospitals. The trial, delayed by psychiatric evaluations, began in 1968, 11 years after his arrest. By then, the public's fascination had transformed him into something larger than life, a living myth of the American Midwest. He was no longer just a man. He was a reflection of what people feared lurked behind the picket fences, the monstrous possibility that evil could grow quietly in isolation. When asked during the trial if he felt remorse, Ed paused for several seconds before replying softly, "I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I just wanted Mother back." He was found guilty of first-degree murder, but legally insane. The judge committed him to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Reporters noted that when the verdict was read, Ed smiled faintly, as though relieved. Perhaps for the first time, he understood he would never again be alone. He spent the next decades there and later at Mendota Mental Health Institute, where he became a model patient, polite, quiet, even helpful. He tended the garden, read pulp magazines, and played cards with staff. Nurses said he rarely spoke of the outside world. But sometimes, late at night, he would hum hymns his mother used to sing. And those who heard him said his face would change, softening, almost childlike, as if he were back on the farm again, sitting beside Augusta, reading scripture by lantern light. The world would go on calling him the Butcher of Plainfield, but in Ed's mind he was still just a son, still trying, even in confinement, to please the only voice that ever mattered. And though the farmhouse was ash and ruin, its shadow lingered, because the horror Ed Gein created wasn't only in what he did, it was in what he revealed, that the monsters we fear most aren't strangers lurking in the dark. There's sometimes a quiet man next door, the one who smiles, nods, and carries a lifetime of silence behind his eyes. When the cell door shut behind Edward Theodore Gein, it didn't silence his story. It amplified it. Inside the Mendota Mental Health Institute, Ed's days followed a rhythm he had never known on the farm. Structured, warm, and predictable. Breakfast at 7. Therapy at 9. Lunch at noon. Evening recreation. Lights out at 10. For the first time in his life, someone cooked for him, spoke to him kindly, and didn't expect penance in return. He liked it there. Staff described him as courteous, quiet, and unfailingly polite. He gardened in the courtyard, read Western novels, and kept his room tidy. When visitors came, journalists, lawyers, or the rare distant relative, he greeted them with a shy smile, like an old neighbor meeting at the post office. To outsiders, the transformation was chilling. The man who had skinned corpses and fashioned masks from human faces now spent afternoons painting birdhouses. But to Ed, perhaps it made sense. For the first time, the voices had stopped. Augusta was gone. He was safe. Still, beyond those hospital walls, the name Ed Gein had already mutated into something monstrous, an American myth. His crimes had burned themselves into the public imagination, reshaping horror forever. In 1959, a young writer named Robert Bloch, who lived just 30 miles away in Wisconsin, began to wonder what kind of man could live in such isolation, what kind of son could love and fear his mother so much that it broke his mind. He took that idea and created Psycho. Norman Bates, the soft-spoken motel owner who kept his mummified mother upstairs, was born from Ed Gein's legend. The film adaptation, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, premiered in 1960. Audiences screamed in shock as the shower curtain was torn back and Marion Crane met her fate. It was a scene that changed cinema forever, and behind its fiction lay the echo of a lonely Wisconsin farmhouse and the boy who never learned to live without his mother. But Psycho was only the beginning. In 1974, another movie, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, introduced Leatherface, a hulking killer who wore masks made from human skin. The film's director, Tobe Hooper, never denied the influence. It came from Ed Gein, he said simply. Then came Silence of the Lambs in 1991. Buffalo Bill, who skinned his victims to fashion a woman's suit, was another distorted reflection of Gein's pathology. Through these films, the crimes of one man from a forgotten town in Wisconsin became immortal, the blueprint for American horror itself. While the world turned his story into legend, Ed lived quietly, detached from his legacy. When reporters asked if he'd seen Psycho, he nodded politely. "It's okay," he said. "Some parts are funny." The press had tried to paint him as a monster, a word that sells newspapers and seats in theaters. But doctors who worked with him over the years painted a more complicated picture. They described a man stunted emotionally, his mind fractured not by sadism but by suffocating control. He never expressed hatred toward his victims, only longing. His crimes were rooted not in lust, but in obsession, a desperate, pathological yearning to resurrect what death had taken. In a sense, he wasn't trying to destroy life. He was trying to recreate it. That didn't make the horrors any less real, but it made them more tragic. Dr. George Arndt, one of the psychiatrists, once said, Ed Gein was not evil. He was broken, the ultimate product of isolation, repression, and a mother's unrelenting shadow. Still, the public didn't want tragedy. They wanted fear, and Ed Gein became fear incarnate. Collectors bid thousands of dollars for his possessions, even after the farmhouse had burned. His car, the same one he used to transport Bernice Warden's body, was sold at a carnival auction for $760 and exhibited as a sideshow attraction. See, the car of the ghoul of Plainfield. People paid 50 cents each to sit inside it. Parents brought their children. The fascination bordered on morbid worship. The line between disgust and curiosity blurred until Gein became not just a killer, but a symbol. The quiet face of madness beneath small-town America's polished veneer. In 1978, a journalist visited him at Mendota. By then, Ed was 72, his hair thin and gray, his smile gentle but hollow. When asked how he felt about all the books and movies based on his life, he shrugged. "I never meant to hurt anyone," he said softly. I just wanted her back. He spoke of Augusta as though she were in the next room, still powerful, still divine. Even after 30 years in confinement, her ghost lingered like an invisible chain to his caretakers. It seemed almost peaceful. To the world, it was chilling. By the early 1980s, Ed's health declined. He developed respiratory problems and was transferred to St. Mary's Hospital in Madison. Nurses recalled that even as his breathing grew shallow, he remained polite, thanking them for each sip of water, each blanket tucked over him. He died quietly on July 26, 1984, at 77 years old. The official cause was respiratory failure due to cancer. There was no family present. No one claimed his body. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery beside Augusta, the woman who had raised, ruled, and haunted him from cradle to coffin. But even in death, peace eluded him. His gravestone, marked simply Edward Gein, 1906 to 1984, became a macabre pilgrimage site. Visitors chipped pieces off as souvenirs. Teenagers carved their initials beside his name. In 2000, the entire headstone was stolen. It was recovered years later, hundreds of miles away, and quietly placed into storage, never returned to the cemetery. And so the earth above Ed's grave remains bare, unmarked. The man whose name inspired horror no longer even has a name in stone. Perhaps that's fitting, because Ed Gein's story was never really about one man. It was about what hides inside the quiet corners of human nature, about how devotion can decay into obsession, and how loneliness, left to rot, can birth monsters we pretend could never be us. But they can. They always can. And as horror movies roll on and new generations scream at the sight of leather masks and flickering basement lights, the spirit of Plainfield still lingers, whispering through every frame, reminding us of the man who didn't mean to be a monster, but became the blueprint for one. Because long before Hollywood made him famous, Ed Gein had already built the first stage for American horror, a lonely farmhouse, lit only by a lantern, where a mother's voice never stopped echoing. When the doors to Mendota Mental Health Institute closed behind Ed Gein, it was as if the world itself exhaled in relief. The man who had haunted Wisconsin's countryside, who had turned graves into butcher shops and homes into nightmares, was now sealed away, a specter confined to white walls and watchful eyes. Yet, even in confinement, Ed Gein's story refused to die. It seeped through the cracks of history, whispered in newsrooms, echoed in Hollywood, and lingered like smoke over the American imagination. Doctors described him as a polite, cooperative man, one who rarely raised his voice, who thanked the nurses and read Bible verses before bed. To the outside world, that detail was perhaps the most horrifying of all, because behind those calm eyes, there had once been a world of unholy creations. The question was no longer what Ed had done, but why. Psychiatrists studied him like an unsolvable puzzle. Some called him a textbook case of schizophrenia. Others saw him as the product of extreme isolation and religious fanaticism. Ed himself seemed uncertain. He admitted to voices, to losing track of time, to standing in graveyard for hours as if hypnotized. He said he never meant to harm anyone. He simply wanted company. He wanted his mother. That was a refrain that echoed through every evaluation, every interview, every sleepless night. Mother. Decades passed. The frenzy quieted. Tourists drove past Plainfield with cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of the House of Horrors, but they were too late. In March 1958, the old Gein farmhouse, his lair, burned to the ground. No one ever proved how the fire started. Locals said they saw orange light flickering against the horizon, heard the crackle of timber, smelled the bitter smoke. By dawn, all that remained were foundation stones and the iron bed frame where police had found Bernice Wardens. The fire chief said no one had tried to put it out. When reporters asked a local resident about it, he shrugged and said, "Just as well." But even ashes couldn't bury the story. When the auction for Ed's belongings was announced, thousands came. They gathered under the gray Wisconsin sky. Farmers, reporters, curiosity seekers, even souvenir hunters, hoping to buy a piece of infamy. The sheriff's office had destroyed most of the truly grotesque artifacts. The skin masks, the skull bowls, the human belt. But there was still one item that caused a commotion: Ed's old Ford sedan. The very car He used to haul bodies from graveyards and carry Bernice Warden's corpse home. A carnival sideshow operator from Rockford, Illinois, bought it for $760. He painted "See the Gainsayer" on a banner and toured with it across state lines. Families paid 25 cents to look inside. Some spat on it. Others crossed themselves. It was grotesque, exploitative, and somehow fitting, because by then, Ed Gein had become more than a man. He was a legend, a living ghost. In 1968, after more than a decade in Mendota, doctors declared him competent to stand trial. The proceedings were brief. Ed sat quietly beside his lawyer, hands folded, as witnesses described the horrors of his home. The defense didn't contest the facts. They couldn't. The photographs alone were beyond dispute. But they argued insanity, and the court agreed. He was found guilty of first-degree murder, then immediately ruled insane and returned to the hospital for the rest of his natural life. There was no outrage. By then, the nation had moved on to other headlines: Vietnam, assassinations, political unrest. Ed Gein was yesterday's monster. But in Plainfield, his shadow lingered. The town's population shrank. Children grew up hearing warnings. Don't wander too far into the fields. Don't walk home alone at night. The woods, once peaceful, now felt haunted. Inside Mendota, Ed aged quietly. He took up gardening in the courtyard. He painted. He joked with orderlies. When asked about his crimes, he would sometimes smile faintly, as if recalling a dream that wasn't quite real. "They say I did all that," he once told a nurse, "but I can't remember half of it." Whether that was a lie, a defense, or genuine dissociation, no one knew. He lived like that for decades, long after the world forgot him. Then in 1984, at the age of 77, Ed Gein died from respiratory failure due to cancer. There was no ceremony, no family gathering. His remains were buried beside his mother in Plainfield Cemetery, under a simple marker that read Edward Gein, 1906 to 1984. But the peace didn't last. In the years that followed, his grave became a pilgrimage site for macabre curiosity seekers. People chipped off pieces of the headstone as souvenirs. Some carved their names into it. Eventually, in 2000, the entire gravestone was stolen. It resurfaced in 2001, found near Seattle, and was quietly returned to law enforcement. Today, his resting place is unmarked. Only those who know the cemetery's layout can point to the patch of grass where the butcher of Plainfield lies. But Ed Gein's death didn't end his story. It ignited a cultural firestorm. Hollywood devoured the legend. Psycho's Norman Bates, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre's Leatherface, and the Silence of the Lambs' Buffalo Bill all bore his fingerprints. Each one reimagined his crimes through different lenses: obsession, cannibalism, transformation, control. Yet the truth behind them all remained eerier, quieter, and somehow more human. Because Ed's terror didn't come from grandiose evil. It came from loneliness. That's what makes his story endure. He wasn't a towering figure of hatred or rage. He was a meek man who lived with ghosts, who read pulp magazines by lamplight, who built shrines to the dead. His crimes weren't explosions of fury. They were acts of imitation. He tried to recreate the one person he couldn't live without. And in doing so, he became something inhuman. If you drive through Plainfield today, you'd never guess what happened there. The farmlands stretch out like a postcard, green in summer, barren in winter. The old hardware store where Bernice Warden's vanished is gone. The people who remember those days are fading, one by one. Yet, when the wind blows across the marshes, locals say you can still hear it. The faint creak of a screen door, the whisper of footsteps in the corn. Maybe it's just imagination. Or maybe it's the echo of a story America will never stop telling. The story of a man who turned love into horror and a small town into legend. Because the true terror of Ed Gein isn't in the photographs or the crime scene reports. It's in what he represents. The thin, fragile line between the ordinary and the unspeakable. He was a friendly neighbor who fixed your tractor, the quiet man at the grocery counter, the one who never caused trouble. And yet, inside his farmhouse, surrounded by silence and shadows, he built a kingdom of death. And when the truth finally came to light, the world realized something it would never forget. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like us.